Are we allowed to converse while we're going live?
Okay. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think, yeah, Kristen will hit us with the ping here in a moment. Are you in London right now?
No, Netherlands, just outside Amsterdam. Laura's moved here for a work thing, and I'm kind of this is what happens. I remember now. I might have to, this light comes on and off. It's kind of slightly spectral. It could create a kind of thematic sort of interesting backdrop, but I'll just unplug it.
I think we're live. Welcome everyone. My name is Rocco Gangle. It's my pleasure today to introduce John Ó Maoilearca for a talk here through GCAS. I first met John, I believe it was almost 20 years ago at the Collegium Phenomenologicum. And our paths have crossed several times since then. And it's a real pleasure to introduce him for his talk today. John Ó Maoilearca is professor of film and philosophy at Kingston School of Art, Kingston University, London. He's also taught philosophy and film theory at the University of Sunderland, England, and University of Dundee, Scotland. He's published 11 books, including as author, Bergson and Philosophy in 2000, Post-Continental Philosophy and Outline in 2006, Philosophy in the Moving Image, Refractions of Reality in 2010, and as editor, Bergson and the Art of Immanence in 2013, and the Bloomsbury Companion to Continental Philosophy in 2013 as well. His latest book was All Thoughts Are Equal, Laruelle and Nonhuman Philosophy with University of Minnesota Press in 2015. He's currently working on ordinary modes of time travel, so far with only modest success. And I'd like to welcome him today for his talk on spirit in the materialist world. John Ó Maoilearca.
Great. Thank you, Rocky, for that nice introduction. Nice to see you again. Yes, that must have been 2003, I suspect, in Perugia, warmer weather. And thank you to Kristen for this invitation, and it's a great honor. And hopefully, I'm just looking at the logo of the GCAS, so I'm going to read into this the various faces. I can see GCAS, and I'm anthropomorphizing those into 4 different people in the audience, which is a good start anyway. So yes, Rocky mentioned my work on Laruelle, and predating that, with some in-between work on film and philosophy, I wrote a good deal on one other single author, Bergson. And what I'm working at the moment is a kind of a synthesis, you might say, kind of way in which Bergson and Laruelle, I think, can be brought together with an interesting intermediary, namely Bergson's sister, Mina Bergson, also known as Moina Mathers. It was a very interesting career as a mystic, and given Bergson's own very strange ideas concerning matter and spirit, I'm going to correlate those in this talk, which lasts about 50 minutes, with ideas concerning ordinary mysticism in Laruelle's work. And also the larger theme of the democracy of thought, the democracy of approaches to thinking and what is thinking that we find in a non-standard philosophical paradigm, if you like, and whether that can go and actually be connected to not the strange type of way in which Laruelle engages, for instance, with ordinary, or I should say, Gnostic philosophy, but instead with the kind of practice of real mystics like Mina Bergson, who also, vouched for a certain kind of gnosis. What I'm doing here is unscrewing a bulb, which has decided to become possessed by spirits past. It's going to flicker on and off, which might be fun for a little joke for a while, but it's going to become slightly disturbing after too much. So that's why the lighting has suddenly changed. Okay, let's crack on. So in recent work, I have written about a strategy of what I've been calling, and it's not an original term, but it's an old term, supernormalization, that provides, I argue, an exit from the stark duality of natural and supernatural, or of the normal and the paranormal. It offers a supernormal paradigm that thinks only in terms of differences of degree rather than of kind. The category of the supernatural, be it found in religion, the arts, or as we'll see even philosophy as a type of spookiness, is re-rendered as structural, the inconsistent or hyperbolic state of the natural, the outsider whose position must be occupied by someone or thing, nature, for instance, becoming an overfamiliar supernature. For instance, Henri Bergson upheld an ultra-strong realism towards the past, arguing in his major work, Matter and Memory, 1896, that the past persists as real, immanent in the present, and not merely as an outside, transcendent recollection of the past. He even described how, in Matter and Memory, quote, when a memory reappears in consciousness, it produces on us the effect, only the effect of a ghost, of a mysterious apparition, unquote. So far, so spooky. The past as spectre, as memory. Yet this seeming paranormality can be brought down without reduction or elimination through a double maneuver. And this is what I think we see in Bergson. First, there is the seeming naturalistic reduction, the spectre seen as merely a memory, reduction. But then there is a doubled refraction whereby this ghost memory itself is inflated as a real part of the past, a reduction of the reduction, if you like. The part, memory, is not an irreal representation of the past, but an actual fragment of the past surviving in a hyperbolic state as an exception or inconsistency. The past as merely my memory becomes my memory as the past in part. And this partiality then is a difference of degree only, not a substantial one of kind. And that's rather dense and it's kind of intro type material, and I'm going to unpack it and repeat that in various guises as I go through. So take another little bit of, not so much paranormal, but what we would clearly describe as science fiction. The notion of time travel that Rocky mentioned I've been having a go at. Now, time travel is another area of this research. Leaving aside any technological means that might make physical time travel theoretically possible, and even mundane, the experience of being in a period of time outside of the standard Newtonian flow of our natural lifetime, its phenomenology, so to speak, can be reduced to a delusion or hallucination of some sort, perhaps with some underpinning pathology, or at least anomaly of the brain. Yet this reduction can itself be reduced so that we now see the brain hallucination itself as a real kind of time travel. So what's sometimes described as mental time, merely mental time travel, can be, if you have a non-representationalist notion of mind, an immanentist like Bergson's notion of mind, that can be re-rendered as a type of real time travel in part. So consciousness experience as mere brain event becomes the conscious brain event moving in a new time, a kind of panpsychic time travel. So it's not merely in the head. Yes, it is in the head, but it's not merely in the head. It's not deflationary. It's not reductive in that way. It is in the head because it is a real partial time travel in that kind of Laruellian kind of immanentist sense. Deflation followed by re-inflation. I had previously called this strategy a refractive reduction or full anthropomorphism, modeled on Bergson's theory of complete relativity in his book, Duration and Simultaneity. But it is also, I think, a kind of low-key mundanization of the supernatural, an extraction of the supernatural by ordinary means. There is more to this use of the ordinary than as redemptive epistemology, however. Take mysticism as a further example of spooky philosophy. Francois Laruelle writes of an ordinary mysticism, wherein he claims that, quote, the mystical is pre-philosophical, or as we will say, ordinary, and that ordinary man is a mystical living being, unquote. Here the mystical is connected directly with the ordinary, but in a non-standard philosophical mode, rather than as only epistemology. Laruelle goes on to say how, quote, as absolute science with a mystical foundation, Absolute practice remains passive as the real itself and is not a mode of intervention into the world, of which it would otherwise be a relative part. Unquote. This is because, he later tells us, quote, the one is the element of the mystical and grounds an ordinary mysticism, unquote. So striving, for instance, for a union with the one, some kind of ecstatic mystical union with the one, a kind of stereotype of mysticism, is for Laruelle redundant, because we are already in the one, already and ordinarily mystic in that immanentist sense. One question arising from these thoughts so far, therefore, is whether this one might be read as Laruelle's version of Bergson's, sometimes what's called the open hole, as favored, for instance, in his Deleuzian readers, i.e. the larger processes within which my memory moves me as a part. And this idea brings me to Mina Bergson, Henri Bergson's sister, younger sister. A fascinating yet little known moment in philosophical history occurred at the turn of the 20th century when Henri Bergson and his sister, Mina, also known as Moina Mathers after her marriage to Samuel MacGregor Mathers, a fellow occultist, were both living, Mina and Henri, in Paris and working on seemingly very different but nonetheless complementary approaches to questions concerning the nature of matter, spirit, and their interaction. And just as an interesting biographical note, Henri had already been in Paris. He was born in Paris, but his parentage is not French. None of the Bergson family have any French blood in them. They are Anglo-Irish, Polish, Jewish extraction. And they were wandering around Europe, and they passed through Paris for a while, the family. Henri was born there, brought up there a little bit, but the rest of the family then went off to Britain. And Henri finished his French studies in France and became a naturalized French person, and seemingly the kind of supreme French philosopher for a while, but he is not French. So he was back, stayed in Paris, and his sister then joined him from London to stay in Paris for a number of years and doing her own alternative type of mystical philosophy. But oddly enough, they never refer to each other in their work. They were seemingly estranged. So both living in Paris and working on seemingly different but nonetheless complementary approaches to questions concerning the natures of matter, spirit, and their interaction. He, of course, was a leading professor within the French Academy, soon to become the most renowned European philosopher in the first years of the new century. She was his seemingly estranged sister, though in her own right, already celebrated as a feminist and occultist, performing on theatre stages around Paris, while also leading one of the most important occult societies of that era, the Alpha A Omega order. One was a respectable intellectual, the other a notorious mystic artist who, together with her husband and fellow occultist, Samuel MacGregor Mathers, has been described by Denis Denisov as the, quote, neo-pagan power couple of the Belle Epoque, unquote. So Mina had moved to Paris in 1892, at about the same time that her brother Henri was working on his most interesting and strange book for many, Matter and Memory. Indeed, from 1900 onwards, she began to perform publicly certain occult rites, the rites of Isis, for example, in public and to great acclaim, at precisely the same time when Bergson was delivering his famous lectures on his own metaphysics at the Collège de France to increasing adulation. Neither Henri nor Mina left any record of their attitudes towards the work of the other, and we can imagine all sorts of reasons why. And yet their views on spirit, mysticism, and matter converge on many fronts. As an occultist and performance artist, the first female member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and subsequent co-leader with husband Samuel of the Alpha and Omega Order, she is certainly an intriguing figure, though mostly forgotten today in the history of ideas. However, as a spiritualist and mystic, scryer, astral traveler, and image maker with significant ideas about spirit and matter, her work also throws a new light on the meaning of Bergsonian philosophy, broadening it, expanding what might be meant by that term, such that it doesn't remain solely anchored in Henri Bergson's worldview. So this is not to say that her role is simply to act as a supplement to her brother's thought. Her own writing makes this clear. Documents laying out her methods and ideas amount to 4 core manuscripts that we have in our possession so far. Her 1926 foreword to the second edition of Samuel Mather's Kabbalah Unveiled, and 3 teaching texts, or flying rolls. These flying rolls were types of lecture as well as instruction manual for members of the Golden Dawn and Alpha and Omega. Alongside these writings, surviving documentation, props, and other paraphernalia from her and Samuel's activities in Paris, we also have all of the ritualistic practices of the Golden Dawn and Alpha and Omega handbooks on magical practices, comprising the copious phrases, symbols, languages, props, costumes, sets, mathematical equations, that's one for you, Rocky, colors, choreographies, and stagings that were part of any member's initiation and ongoing training as they moved from neophyte through the higher levels of knowledge within each order. Returning to Laruelle, therefore, we might ask whether Mina Bergson's own absolute practice, to use Laruelle's term, can be found in her mystical performances, as well as, if you want, a non-standard way of philosophizing. And also whether they can be made ordinary without reduction through supernormalization. Indeed, in her own theorization of occult practices, as we will see, we can go beyond any merely decorative and aesthetical interpretation to find her use of costume, props, movement, and posture all playing a role as valid forms of knowledge, equal to any science of the one. Yet how would Laruelle's proclaimed democracy of thought, where all kinds of thinking are equalized, stand alongside the secret and private personal knowledge that purportedly belongs to certain mystical practices, such as the very ones found in hermetic orders like the Golden Dawn? Theirs is a knowledge that is only laid down in clandestine writings, pictures and diagrams, or performed in special mysteries, or spoken in esoteric languages. Can such avowedly occult knowledge also participate within a democracy of knowledge? A valid question. But this is precisely my point, and another reason for this engagement with Mina Bergson's ordinary mysticism, that is, as a test case for the equality of thought and knowledge. I'm just wondering, Rocky, I'm looking at the chat and I see there's 5. It says, I'm looking at, I just see the icon for chat. Shall we press it and see what people are saying?
I think that Creston is on YouTube and keeping track of questions that people are posting there and then just transferring them to the chat. So think of it's just a running tally of comments and questions. And if you wanted to stop and look at them now, you could, but I think you're also free to just, hold those as a kind of catalog.
The odd illumination, because I can see when I lean in, I light up, and then I go back and I get dark, and it's, maybe somebody's having an epileptic attack. I think it might well be disturbing. But there you go. It's the rites of Isis. Isis, probably the Egyptian goddess. She had rights, presumably, of a sort. But it's rights. So we'll point that out. Okay. Anthony Paul Smith and, there I go, dark again, and Nicola Rubshak, writing on the topic of relativism in non-philosophy, state that, quote, the real cannot be captured by philosophy, but instead authorizes the equivalency of all philosophies, all knowings, as relative before the real. Or in other words, the real is not ineffable, but infinitely effable, unquote. With Laruelle, what might look like a relativism is always a real expansion, an inclusivity of thought. Nothing is unreal. The non-standard philosophy of photography, for instance, is not simply the generation of new thoughts about subjectivity or light, the flash, so forth, backlighting even, through an unorthodox source, but instead a material practice of thought through as Laruelle puts it, a photography of philosophy. Such work acts as a non-philosophical practice, especially in terms of the materiality of photographic performance involving posture, exposure, definition, and resolution. And these are not mere metaphors, by the way, but models invoked to mutate what counts as philosophical practice. It is not a philosophy, or one more philosophy of art or an art. It is an art of philosophy, a photography of philosophy. So what was referred to earlier as the infinite effability. Can this infinite effability of non-philosophy include the knowledge practices and mystical performances of Mina Bergson? In other words, can the methods of mysticism be used without necessary religious or supernatural commitment as a model of knowing? Or must they be rejected as a new authority, a crypto-philosophical hierarchization of knowledge? As they stand, or at least as they are ordinarily read, perhaps the second suggestion is unavoidable. But in another sense of an ordinary reading, an extraordinary or supernormalized mysticism might be redeemable and serve as an alternative model for non-standard philosophy by offering us what Laruelle calls, quote, a heterogeneity of philosophical logics, unquote. In 1985, Laruelle wrote as follows, quote, a mystical ordinary acting, determination in the last instance, that indifferences the world, makes it contingent or unilateral without negating or objectivating it. It has a first effect, allowing for the description of the world in its remoteness and its strangeness, of its heterogeneity, the heterogeneity of philosophical logics as fundamentally undecidable. The strangeness of the world, or real, as Laruelle would later put it, can be described with heterogeneous logics that belong to ordinary acting, understood equally as performance and performative action. And such first acting in a mystical mode, as he calls it, has other critical effects. Its heterogeneity, its heretical thinking even, heresy being another term he uses, actually resists authority. Quote, there is a minoritarian or real critique of authorities. It is located in the simultaneously contemplative and practical, mystical and pragmatic, acting of which, I've emphasized that poorly, it is located in the simultaneously contemplative and practical, mystical and pragmatic, acting of which ordinary is capable with regard to the natural and inevitable claim of authorities to count for human them to non-standardize the ideas of her brother. Am I coming through fine? I just had a little kind of symbol come up saying my internet connection is unstable.
Yeah. Could you repeat the last maybe 3-4 sentences?
Yeah, I missed that as well. I wasn't sure if that was just me, but you froze, and at least on my screen, for about 10 seconds.
Okay, hold on. I wonder why that happened. Just making sure I've got the, yeah, I'm on the best. I'm getting rid of something. I've rebooted the computer. I'm kind of running this as clean as I can. Let's start. Okay. So the strangeness of the world, or real, as Laruelle would later put it, can be described with heterogeneous logics that belong to ordinary acting, understood equally as performance and performative action. And such first acting in a mystical mode, as he puts it, also has other critical effects. Its heterogeneity, its heretical thinking even, actually resists authority. Quote, there is a minoritarian or real critique of authorities. It is located in the simultaneously contemplative and practical, mystical and pragmatic, acting of which ordinary man, not philosophizing man, is capable with regard to the natural and inevitable claim of authorities to count for human reality, of the state to exhaust the real, unquote. Do you get all that? Not bad? Okay. It is this Laruellian stance on the ordinary mystical that makes it so intriguing to look anew at Mina Bergson and to articulate them as non-standard philosophical practice, but also to use them to non-standardize the ideas of her brother.
John, you just froze again, unfortunately.
History of ideas. Nevertheless, be it within a philosophical lineage, Hegel's Gnosticism, Deleuze's post-Kantian esotericism, or the mystical sources of existentialism, say, or a scientific one, Newton and alchemy, for instance, looking into such dark reflections is still a valuable form of inquiry, and indeed a novel one in Bergson's case. Moreover, as Joshua Ramy cautions us, there remains, quote, a contemporary ambivalence over the validity and significance of esoteric, let alone occult, apprehensions of nature and mind, such that a certain political risk comes with any such approach, unquote. Yet it is a risk worth taking, as he says. As Henri Bergson today is increasingly being unfolded within the history of philosophy as a known quantity, perhaps a few peculiar ideas in the philosophy of mind and the metaphysics of time, it remains important to remind ourselves just how of non-authority, so to speak, one can interlace this already outlandish idea.
Yes? Sorry, could you, just that you froze there for a second, could you go back to, I think you said that to mind the, just if you could just roll back about 10 seconds. We lost like maybe 2 sentences.
Oh, sugar. I lost what? The word to wit. Do you remember that? No.
To wit?
To wit. I said to wit. I don't normally say to wit. I say it in papers and books sometimes. Did you get that word? To wit?
No, we didn't. No, we missed that.
Oh wow! Oh gosh! Okay, there we go.
I think.
More than 10 seconds. Right. What is wrong? I'm going to switch. If I switch Wi-Fi's, we'll just crash, won't we? What's playing up with this one? I've got a mesh. I've got a booster and everything in the thing. Ugh. Hurry up, vaccine. All right. Okay. So I was talking about Joshua Ramy saying that there's value in looking at esoteric philosophy.
Yeah, and that's right about there that you.
Right then. And so basically, yeah, just to kind of talk it through rather than just read it out. So Bergson himself is, a very strange philosopher, I think, and just as at the moment he is increasingly being, in a sense, domesticated within the history of ideas. He's a guy with a certain kind of position in philosophy of time, philosophy of mind, and somewhat tames, I think, just how out there some of his thoughts were. So if we look to matter memory and take seriously, its outlandish claims, this ultra realism towards the past, that namely, when we remember the past, it is the past itself that is manifesting its own partial survival, not a representation. We take that idea on one hand, and on the other side, we have Laruelle as a protector, so to speak, and guarantor of non-authority. Interlace Bergson's strange ideas with the seemingly even more bizarre practices of
Well, it looks like John's frozen again.
Yeah. I'm going to swap. I'm going to maybe.
If you want to, you can restart. You can reboot. Just click on the link, and then we can just continue. We'll keep it live if you want to. If that will help.
I'm going to change. I'm going to change Wi-Fi. See what happens. I'm going to do two things.
Okay.
One Wi-Fi.
And then we get the frozen face. Thanks for your patience. Those of you who are keeping track of this on the channel, we'll have John back in just a few seconds, hopefully. And there he is. Let's see. Okay, John, we can see you. Just unmute yourself and you should be good to go. Yeah. Although we can't hear you now.
Not yet, not yet. Hold on, you will. Can't you hear me now?
Indeed.
Yeah? Okay. Let's see. I just have to talk to my phone and keep my phone happy and make it sure it's charged and likes this laptop. That's a shame. Sorry about that. These things are sent to try us. Not the worst thing to happen in the last year, really. Okay, so basically what I was saying was, so on the one hand, you've got Bergson, an increasingly domesticated philosopher whose core ideas, especially in matter and memory, are outrageous, really, when you think about this ultra-realism towards the past. And if we link that or use as a kind of protector, Laruelle and his democracy of thinking, it's possible, theoretically, obviously, to interlace Henri Bergson with Mina Bergson and her own even more outlandish ultra-realism towards the past, namely in the idea that one can invoke a goddess first recorded circa 2,500 years ago through performance. Now, this is not, this is going to get into the technicalities of invocation versus evocation. Evocation is bringing the spirit into the world. Invocation is bringing a spirit into one's own body. And this is what she was doing. Performed at a theatre, for instance, like L'Ordinaire in Paris, but also in other secret locations. Mina Bergson would invoke the goddess Isis bodily, imminently, and in person. But of course, what all of those terms mean is the big question. The study of Henri and Mina Bergson then is simultaneously about the ordinary and extraordinary, the philosopher and the non-standard philosopher, everyday faculties of mind and their supernormalized power, different ways of reading, thinking, but also different logics. To personalize this difference with names, one might say that where Henri writes a philosophy of mysticism, at one point he wrote The Two Sources of Morality and Religion in 1932, where he does something like that, Mina performs a mysticism of philosophy. So I'm using that inversion in the Laruelle instance. So next section, hyper-ritual. So what did Mina Bergson's mystical practices comprise? To answer this, we must firstly look at the purpose of orders such as the Golden Dawn. This simple following description from Christopher Armstrong sums it up well enough. It was, quote, the acquisition of a certain gnosis, or private experiential contact with ultimate realities through the deliberate deployment of incantations and rituals drawn from various sources, some genuinely ancient and associated with the historic Rosicrucian movement, some ostensibly archaic, but in fact of very recent concoction. Emphasis on the word concoction. They were just making this stuff up, seemingly. Pache Armstrong, however, the public performances of Mina Bergson et al. Were never intended to be historically accurate. They were always clear about this. However, but were creative and artistic invocations, a performance art, according to Denis Denisov, who I cited earlier, with ceremonies that were, as Frederick Lee described them at the time, artistic in the extreme, unquote. We get one glimpse of this art and performance and rituality in Mina Bergson's work in the dedication to her, which the poet and one-time Golden Dawn member W.B. Yeats began his 1925 book, A Vision, with. Quote, perhaps this book has been written because a number of young men and women, you and I among them, their number, met nearly 40 years ago in London and in Paris to discuss mystical philosophy. You with your beauty and your learning and your mysterious gifts were held by all in affection. And though, when the first draft of this dedication was written, I had not seen you for more than 30 years, nor knew where you were, nor what you were doing, and though much had happened since we copied the Jewish, and I won't be able to pronounce his name, Shemahamboros Parkos, the explicit name in ancient Hebrew, with its 72 names of God in Hebrew characters, it was plain that I must dedicate my book to you. Now, the interesting point there is actually this little insight into what this group did at one phase, at least, when Yeats was associated with them. But the question of names is worth lingering on for a moment. I've mentioned that Mina Bergson was also known as Moina Mathers. She had various names, performance names, persona, and so on. But possibly the most important was her chosen Golden Dawn magical name, in the Latin Vestigia Nulla Retrorsum, often abbreviated in manuscripts to VNR. Now, this is a condensation of a phrase from Horace's epistles, meaning the past leaves no traces. And it can be variously translated as I leave no traces behind, no stepping back, or most suggestively, leave no trace. These chosen names were often aspirational within such groups, so we could therefore ask what this name might mean in Mina Bergson's case. That the past is ephemeral, a traceless existence in which there is real power of some sort, perhaps, or that there is a desire to be untraceable, to be unmarked in that way. Indeed, we might turn here in the context of performance art, performance being something that is at the heart of Mina's practice. We might turn to Peggy Phelan's thesis in her book Unmarked, concerning performance as unmarked. And that giving it its power is that it is unmarked. And take that idea in the light of Moina's invocation of spirits as an occult performance. In fact, we might say that what is not left behind is also what can be brought to presence in such performance. A movement, a bodily gesture, projected colors, vibrated sounds, but no material residue, no permanent things. Going back to my earlier discussion of spooks and ghosts and so on, we're not talking about substances here, but movements. Not representing or picturing the past, but performing it, even with sometimes images. But images understood immanently, not representationally. And that's the whole opening of matter memory that Deleuzians are so fond of. And no spooky substances either, no confusion of matter and spirit. Indeed, the very idea of a seance or ectoplasm was anathema to the Golden Dawn and Alpha and Omega. They did not practice that kind of magic. The spiritualization of matter, and this is a term that Mina uses a lot, is not its transubstantiation, perhaps, but its ephemeralization. Now, another constant aspect of Mina Bergson's work is the impression of someone who, far from being the stereotype of an aesthetic contemplative, was a woman of action. This would help us get back to Laruelle eventually. Not only had she co-founded a temple and established a major occult order in the Alpha and Omega, her public rites enacted what Denisov describes as, quote, feminist ritual performance, unquote. They were certainly a spectacle, as Orsi Grogan reports, quote, in 1899, Mina and the order caused something of a sensation in Paris when they staged a theatrical performance at La Bourdonnais Theatre called The Rites of Isis. Jules Bois was on stage to explain the ancient cult to the fashionable audience. The Paris correspondent of the Sunday Chronicle reported that Mina achieved a great success. Rivaling her brother in popularity, at least for the moment, she, quote, completely won their sympathy by her graceful attitude and dignified manner. More than that, she is very handsome. She has a beautiful oval face with large black mysterious eyes, and beauty always tells in Paris, unquote. That was quoting the Sunday Chronicle. Back to Grogan. In gratitude for the performance, the ladies offered bouquets of flowers and gentlemen threw wheat on the altar, unquote. Such an engaged, public, engaging spiritualist might well remind us, perhaps, of the heroes and active mystics that Henri Bergson discusses in his 1932 book that we mentioned earlier, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, as indeed exemplars of great mysticism within the Christian tradition. Mina Bergson herself wrote that the mystic, quote, should not retire from the world, that it is better to live amongst others and influence them by our example, unquote. In her 1926 preface to Kabbalah Unveiled, she adds that mysticism, quote, is a system eminently suited to Western occultism, which a man can follow while living the ordinary life of the world, given that this is understood in its highest sense, unquote. ordinary life, presumably, in the highest sense. So much then for the Hermetic, the enclosed. Here, the active mystic meets with the ordinary man, human, and in something like Laruelle's sense too, I would argue. The need to restrain oneself from the usual stereotypes of the mystic of egocentricity and monomania are also uppermost in Mina Bergson's descriptions. In Flying Roll number 21, titled Know Thyself, she writes, quote, "There is too much tendency to wish all to follow the ideal of one. We are apt to forget that the ideal of each will lead to the same truth. We can help each other better then by helping each to rise according to his own ideas rather than, as we often unwisely do, in advising him to rise to what is best in ourselves only. That error of wishing to make another as ourselves is another and very hurtful form of most subtle egotism," unquote. Such a pluralism of approach is also indicated in her more thematic concern with the relationship between science and spiritualism. Indeed, the very notion of know thyself, the Delphic maxim, most famously associated with Socrates, was also connected with other Greek sages, not all of them philosophers in the modern sense, but also scientists, Pythagoras, Thales, artists such as Aeschylus, and of course mystics like Heraclitus. Indeed, on the question of science and mysticism, Mina Bergson often wrote as an ecumenist, endorsing an emergent monism of matter and spirit rather than the usual dualism associated with certain strains of occult thought. Quote from Mina Bergson, "Material science," and here's this line which I foreshadowed earlier, "material science would appear to be spiritualizing itself and occult science to be materializing itself. If not clasping hands, they are certainly making tentative attempts in that direction. That matter and spirit are only opposite poles of the same universal substance," unquote. Of course, this duality of orientation, polarity, over a dualism of substance is highly reminiscent of the opening of Matter and Memory by her brother. Quote, "We will assume for the moment that we know nothing of theories of matter and theories of spirit, nothing of the discussions of the reality or ideality of the external world. Here I am in the presence of images, in the vaguest sense of the word. Images perceived when my senses are opened to them, unperceived when they are closed." And these images, a controversial choice of term for Bergson, but these images are again not understood as representations or pictures. So instead of a dichotomized matter and spirit, for Henri Bergson, there is a unity within a universal imagery. And in 1907, when Henri begins the third chapter of his famous Creative Evolution book, with an attempt to explain the seemingly mysterious correlations between intellect and materiality, he will propose that the two are, quote, "derived from a higher and wider form of existence," unquote, and that it must have been the one process that, quote, "cut out matter and the intellect at the same time from a stuff that contained both," unquote. Mina Bergson's universal substance again, perhaps, or what she also called, quote, "the eternal attraction between ideas and matter, with matter and ideas or spirit as only poles within one spectral continuous entity that she described as, or named, the secret of life," unquote. Okay, concluding section. We must all be fairly tired. The following is a quotation from Bergson's 1911 lecture, The Perception of Change, which he gave at the University of Oxford. Quote, "Let us reflect for a moment on this present, which alone is considered to have existence. What precisely is the present? My present at this moment is the sentence I am pronouncing, but it is so because I have to limit the field of my attention to my sentence. This attention is something that can be made longer or shorter, like the interval between 2 points of a compass. Let us go further. An attention which could be extended indefinitely would embrace, along with the preceding sentence, all the anterior phrases of the lecture and the events which preceded the lecture, and as large a portion of what we call our past as desired." So that's quite an ultra-realist statement. In a sense, time travel is possible through expanding our attention rather than through an external machine. In extending this attention, by whatever means, he says that what we call our past is embraced within what we call our present. The former distends the latter. What Henri Bergson also writes of in Matter Memory is a real past surviving in the elastic present, and Mina Bergson practices as the invocation of a distant past, Isis or whatever, through her own body, would then be the expansions of this, there are different, in a sense, degrees of extremity of this thesis. One of them academic and respectable, the other occult and outlandish, but both of them realized not as substance theories, but as theories of movement, in a sense, theories of time. When researching, as I've been, the mutual relations of Mina and Henri Bergson, I can, of course, be seen to be traveling amongst nothing more than my own philosophical hallucination, and not merely as a conjectured set of reciprocating positions between these two Anglo-Irish poles, but also as a number of dreamlike coincidences. Perhaps that is all that exists between the ideas of the Bergson siblings, therefore, a set of coincidental thoughts on the nature of matter, spirit, and movement, or in their respective vocabularies, which I haven't had time to go into detail here with: magic, fabulation, the image, the virtual, and the astral. The virtual and the astral are well worth looking at together, side by side. So perhaps this is just a set of dreams. And now I'm going to say something about dreams. So that was a kind of deflationary. Maybe the guy, this is all in my head. You know, it's just a set of dreamlike coincidences. Now let's inflate. Dreams, in Henri Bergson's view at least, are only, as he puts it, relaxed forms of perception. One is not locked out from the world. One is not in a state of no consciousness. It's just a different kind of way of perceiving what is around, a very relaxed one. And in this relaxed form of perceptions are overwhelmed with wildly associating images from pure memory, or what he calls the phantasmagoria of the past. In other words, for Bergson, everyday perception involves the actualization of a certain amount of the past, memory that I need to have in order to get through the day. That is tiring. When I relax through fatigue and sleep and dream, I am still perceiving and interacting. There is still that dynamic between perception and memory, but memory, there is more memory, the past, coming forward, but it comes forward chaotically, randomly, in response to both external perception and internal perception. You know, what kind of cheese did you eat last night? And had those terrible nightmares. We might even describe dreams as hyper-correlationist, rather than just simply correlationist. According to Laruelle, on the other hand, every philosopher, not only the rather eccentric ones, hallucinates a world that has withdrawn itself from the real, only then to count itself as the authoritative account of this world it's created as the real. This is not simply a sub-Kantian admonition against the misplaced ambitions of metaphysics. Philosophy, for Laruelle, simply is the gesture in thought that gives itself the authority to pronounce on the essence of reality, to master it from a hallucinated outside. It is the withdrawn or departed part of the real. The hyperbolic part, or even we might say, the self-proclaimed supernatural or super-real, standing over and beyond the real, transcending it. Irrespective of whether any one particular historical philosophy is supposedly materialist, idealist, realist, whatever else, qua philosophy, its real conditions are, in a sense, supernatural, spooky even, according to Laruelle. This departed, ghostly philosophy is neither spectral nor ontological on account of an aporetic presence as absence, that is, as fundamental ontology. No, Bergson, for instance, in the case of Bergson, there's a multiplication of the present rather than its dissolution in absence. For Laruelle, I would say, philosophy is only the thought, or any thought, that sees itself united with the real without remainder, and by dint of its description alone, that is therewith departed and becoming philosophical. Now, taking this warning seriously for my own endeavor, it might be the case that I can only be honest about my own inventions and allow them to fictionalize alongside the real, rather than to be about anything genuinely actual, such as what was really going on between Henri and Mina Bergson. Were they really in cahoots? Or is this just my hallucination? We can just take it in a sense as an interesting correlation, or covariance, as I'm later going to call it. All the same, and as James Burton points out, as regards the early Christian Gnostics, fictioning does not have to imply falsehood or an inexistent, but rather the immanent creativity of spirit. Quote, when Bishop Irenaeus attacks Valentinian Gnostics for creating imaginary fiction, or new forms of mythological poetry, and for relying, on feeling and intuition rather than divine authority, he is criticizing precisely what those same Gnostics see as a great resource, the soteriological use of fiction, or in other words, fabulation. Whereas the special gnosis by which the Gnostic Christians defined themselves may give them the outward appearance of cultish mystics, what it really amounts to is the knowledge that anyone may have a relationship with the divine through creative activity, through fictionalizing, and that all claims to privileged exclusive access to God are themselves pure static fictions. And the kind of the to and fro there of positions there, you can see kind of the ghost of Laruelle in those Gnostics, those particular, in the Valentinian Gnostics, saying that there are various ways of getting to God, and those who believe that they are, in a sense, they have the direct line. They're the ones who have, in a sense, put themselves outside. So, claims to privileged, exclusive access to God are, indeed, as Mina Bergson said earlier, a subtle egotism. Where Gnostic knowledge need not imply authority, any privileged access to God or the real is a philosophical gesture rather than a mystical one, at least for these Gnostics. Now, in his 1927 book, Future of an Illusion, Freud talks about Romain Rolland's term, oceanic feeling, that sensation of an indissoluble bond between oneself and the external world, the quasi-mystical sensation of losing oneself in union with the cosmos. For Rolland, this affect is the source of various symptoms associated with all the religiously minded, not just mystics. In Freud's naturalization of this view, somewhat predictably, it becomes the remnant of an infantile consciousness that has not yet differentiated itself from others. For Laruelle, alternatively, any such unity, any all, is an illusion, including that of the philosophers. Yet mysticism for him does not necessarily mean real immersion within or union with the real or the one either, as we heard earlier. Immanence within the real, the universe, is our given state. All is real. It is the outside, the departed, that thinks it sees the all from its transcendent position, its posited authority, which is a real hallucination. If seeing ghosts, as memory in philosophical psychology, is credulous in its own context, then all of philosophy is credulous as regards its own form, though most often unwittingly. Standard philosophy, philosophy as decision, as cut and withdrawal, is a ghost that walks alone, a departed vision that may or may not see itself as a vision of the departed. According to Laruelle, one last quote, I think, quote, unity is the mystery and the bad philosophical mysticism, the obscure point of reason that ordinary mysticism must suppress or confine to the world. The solution is the suppression of the problem of representation, of its agreement with the object, pre-established harmony or not, of its conditioning, genetic or not, of the object, as a problem that is not real, but one that is wholly enveloped in the veil of the unitary illusion, as he puts it. Unitary illusion is not exclusive to bad mysticism, but belongs to every philosophical view that would reduce a multiplicity to an arche, an X, rather than leave all things equal and plural in the real. Ordinary mysticism, which I have linked with Mina Bergson's engaged progressive activism, as well as to Henri Bergson's non-reductive naturalism, is not guilty of this, at least. Just as Henri Bergson in his essay, An Introduction to Metaphysics, tries to think unity and multiplicity together in the images of duration, so Mina Bergson in Kabbalah Unveiled writes of, quote, a plurality whose action is unified, and unity whose action is pluralized when thinking of the divine as single or as a plural set of forces. Indeed, the charge that mystical systems of thought desire unity with one absolute principle may well be undeserved in many cases, at least in terms of their underlying metaphysics. Certainly such closure through unity was not the hallmark of either Bergson's ontology, Mina or only. Last paragraph. So if the coincidences, these dreamlike correlations I've come up with, of this unique dyad of Henri and Mina, between the philosopher and the mystic, are but a dream, then that is a deflation, and it undoubtedly emerges as a set of fairly wild images, though I would say that they are not false representations. They are all, in a sense, not just a sense, but immanently, they are all parts of the real, or the whole, inflation. And moreover, being only parts rather than wholes, there is no unity here, no metaphysics of identity, absolute union, be it familial, conceptual, or otherwise. It is always and ever a covariance of movements in these matters, rather than a reduction of one substance correlated to another, even if it is a thinking substance and a non-thinking extended substance. In the pairing of Henri and Mina, we see two allied attempts to naturalize spirit and spiritualize matter at work, two different and yet co-varying ways of rethinking naturalism and spiritualism beyond deflation or inflation. They are, as I have said, supernormal, one of which was always well acknowledged at the time and subsequently, Henri's, the other, Mina's, having become lost to contemporary view, even as its performative, mystical, and artistic approach to spirit and matter becomes all the more timely. And I will stop there. Thank you. And apologies for the break in transmission. Thank you for bearing with us.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks so much. I'd like to allow the folks on the YouTube stream a minute or two to compile their questions, and then they'll get transferred here to the Zoom chat maybe in a moment.
All right.
While that's happening, I guess I'd like to begin with a question. I really appreciated the talk and the kind of wonderful interplay between philosophical conceptualization and the kind of sociology and cultural history of this interesting moment of occultism and neo-paganism in Europe at that time, and this kind of fascinating familial dyad of the two Bergsons. I guess my question would be about that mode of performance and the kind of background impulses that led to a rise of occultism and neo-paganism in people like Yeats. I think there's both a kind of a disenchantment with Christianity in its modern form, and there's also this desire for the past. And so it seems to me important that her performances were an attempt to either to evoke or to invoke Isis, right? And that even the name Isis would be kind of redolent of an ancient wisdom and an ancient presence. And it seems to me that kind of turn in occultism always is always tinged, or can be tinged, with a certain reactionary quality.
Of course,
right?
Yeah.
There's this looking for the true, authentic past, but it seems that at the same time, it's what's most interesting and creative and futural, right? It seems like what is found in the past, precisely because it's so ancient, is a kind of infinite reservoir of possibilities, right? And this seems very close to Bergson's, Henri Bergson's philosophy, right? That memory, as the cone goes further and further back, it envelops more and more. And there's, rather than that being increasingly calcified, the way I think we tend to think of the past as, the further you go back, the less, it's as if it's more and more unchangeable. It's as if for Bergson, the further you go back, the more vital and alive it becomes, because it's been refreshed.
Exactly, because his notion of the past, and indeed, in a sense, time travel, is not as we would. It's not spatialized, basically. So most models of time travel involving a machine and so on like that are basically, for Bergson, just traveling around in space. They're just, because they don't understand that the differences of time are qualitative, and so going into the past is not going into a version of the kind of not now or previously now. It's going into a different kind of ontology, and that's why the kind of this kind of different. It's part and whole. It's mereological relationship between psychology and ontology, such that what some people would see as a kind of psychologism, you could say, well, yes, but that's because Bergson understands psyche as movement, as a kind of, so it is a part of a kind of broader metaphysics of movement, of which psyche is a kind of directionality. And he sometimes describes psychic and physic as simply different orientations of movement, and entropy and negentropy and this kind of thing. And when he broadens it out into the kind of cosmic view and creative evolution. But what's interesting about, yes, so you can look at Yeats and so on, and his unfortunate life choices, parts of his work. But what's interesting is that Golden Dawn, Alpha and Omega, these groups were very progressive. You might think there's reactionary elements of romanticism, etc., but they were feminist, principles of equality, and they were giving education to women. Many, 40, 50% of their membership was made up of women. And after Samuel Mathers died, Mina was the head of the Alpha and Omega movement. And women couldn't get education at universities. They couldn't go to university at that time. But here they would be getting degrees and grades of knowledge. Some of us, somewhat cobbled together, fantastic, but they would have to learn Hebrew, Greek, Latin. There would be an education of sorts, kind of in a sort of para-academical style going on there. And it's no surprise that they were, myriad with feminist actionary, feminist activists, vegetarians, anti-vivisection movement. All of this was happening around the same time. In terms of politics, were they avowedly socialist? That's not so obvious. I'd imagine they are slightly more authoritarian in the kind of politics. You had to go through the grades of knowledge to kind of have a sort of pyramid shaped type of structure. But otherwise, they principled in terms of race, gender, very much democratized and equalized. In terms of how they practiced. Some of their views, depending on what you understand by the past, you can regard that as romantic and reactionary. But if you think of the past not as a kind of a line going backwards, but as, in a sense, an other present, in a sense, an extended version of the present, then it's not, in a sense, going backwards or going forwards. That kind of spatial imagery of progressive, regressive is already, in a sense, buying into a spatialized theory of time travel, if you like.
So then, do you think, is there a way to characterize the source of this kind of inventiveness and progressive experimentation? Like, where is it coming from in these movements? Because it certainly is there, but it seems as if if you wanted the reactionary element, it seems like it's possible to kind of isolate it or describe. It makes sense that would be linked to this kind of spatialized link, but the inventiveness, is it kind of ex nihilo, or is there a way to account for?
There'll always be.
Things are more inventive than others.
I wouldn't say it's ex nihilo, but obviously, in a sense, you can have a narrative concerning sociology and what's going on. The turn to occult late 19th century, obviously surely no coincidence that we have the rise of science, urbanization, industrialization, in the turn even in the early 20th century to the occult, and the kind of magic that these groups did not practice, seances and that kind of carry on, clearly correlated with a war, basically, war dead, huge swathes of the population lost. And there was Oliver Lodge and various scientists who were, in a sense, increasingly becoming interested in the paranormal and psychical research. And this is the origin of the Society for Psychical Research that had Bergson as his president at one point. But it's in that period of, in a sense, of an expansion of science that is dovetailing or intersecting with social events such as urbanization, industrialization, the disenchantment of nature, and of course, World War. But it's interesting how many of the spiritualists, rather than in a sense react against science, they often tried to, and what's his name, Richard Noakes writes about this very well, but try to bring in the latest science. So the telegraphy, X-rays, radioactivity, and those were, amongst other kind of more modern marvels, they brought in as ways to explain the spiritual dimension. Later on, higher levels in mathematics, higher dimensions in mathematics were also brought in, non-Euclidean spaces, as ways, fifth dimension, sixth dimension. This is where the spirits operate. So it's the new sciences, the increasing power of science was actually, there was an attempt to second to spiritualist approaches. Often, nonetheless, I would say from a Bergsonian point of view, simply understanding spirit as some kind of quasi-matter, quasi-thing, a spatialized substance of some sort or another, rather than as he says himself, the only way to understand and discuss the mind-body problem is in terms of time rather than space. If you stick to space and substance, then you're never going to solve it, or well, would at least come to an adequate explanation. Tesla and the Bergsons, I don't know. I'm just looking at some of the questions. How spirit can be transferred? How did Nina transform into Isis? Those first two questions, that's GCAS to everyone, but
I believe that those questions were asked on the YouTube stream, and they've Creston has just basically repeated them
up. So what I'm just saying, all I'm saying is that it would be, from the Bergsonian point of view, possible to answer those in terms of substances, or you would have to bring up some sort of kind of Hollywood ghostly metaphysics where things are going to just appear as a kind of ether or some strange type of quasi energy, which is not that's not the kind of proper vocabulary that'll move the discussion forward, according to Henri Bergson, and I think tacitly performed by his sister as well. In other words, she's not trying to evoke a spirit, but invoke through movement, such that, in a sense, what is an identity, the identity of Isis or any other thing, is itself a complexity of movement, and complexities of movement can survive, in a sense, and continuous, this notion Bergson has of a heterogeneous continuity, can continue through different bodies, but can never be disembodied. And it's not like the digital and analog, by the way, but some people might say, or information, if you're into Simondon or something, but it's not like that, I think. It's a notion of qualitative movement that can be passed on. So Bergson himself talks about Socrates as an identity of Socrates as a Socratic movement, and that is what survives after the biographical person named Socrates dies, for instance. So he talks about that in a kind of prosaic way, but his sister is invoking or performing that similar thesis of an identity as a movement that can be performed again and again and survive. So it's not about, consciousness understood as a kind of quasi-spiritual energy or anything like that. Though it might be connected to it, if that could be a correlation, but that's not, a necessary idea, I think. But anyway, yes, I don't know. Worth having Tesla and the Bergsons, I don't know.
Yeah, just as one final comment, it does seem that what you've described and discussed today is part of this very important part of modernism that's often left behind. If you think of the work of Joyce alongside Yeats, that Joyce is all about metempsychosis, and it isn't a kind of wacky spiritualism, but I think it's exactly what you're discussing here, this idea that the identity of the individual might be something like a pattern of meaning, and that this is something that's happening all the time, that this is the very substance of our movement through life is a repetition of these patterns. Okay, yeah, it looks like maybe there's one more question. An interesting maybe final question.
What about Gödel? What about the
Gödel? Yeah, and that maybe if I can paraphrase or nuance, do you think that the kinds of things that you're discussing here that are intrinsically performative, can they be formalized? Is there a way to talk about these things in terms of mathematics or logic, the way that maybe Badiou would want? The Badiou would want to see these things as instantiations of structures that are ultimately expressible set theoretically, or is there kind of irreducible kind of material dimension to this?
I would, yes. There are alternative ways of expressing. To take the Laruellian line. So basically, this is a kind of an exercise in practicing non-standard philosophy. So I invoke Laruelle's name every now and then on the idea that of a democracy of thought and what might alternative ways of doing philosophy look like that are pluralist and not trying to invoke a new authority. Look at the test case of the Gnostic, a certain kind of Gnostic occultists. How would it work there? Seems to be a difficult test case, but it's also a way of stress testing Laruelle, I suppose, is one way of looking at it, is kind of looking at an extreme case and seeing how that could be brought down to earth, so to speak. How can the ordinary mysticism be understood here? But stepping in an alternative vocabulary, not sticking with Laruelle's own vocabulary, because one could write a book about Laruelle and ordinary mysticism that just cites and paraphrases his own material, but doesn't, and Meister Eckhart and so on, the classic example go-to guys that you'd have there. But I don't think that will be as informative or interesting as or experimental. So in terms of the infinite effability of the real, and you know better than anyone else, Laruelle and Badiou, the dynamic there, and Laruelle's reading of Badiou, that the set theoretical expression is another part of the real. Is it the fundamental expression? Is it the foundational? Does it speak the language of being directly, so to speak, as Heidegger thought German did, and so on like that? Is this the new go-to, instead of German poetic, let's go to science, namely mathematical on set theory science? Well, I think that's the gesture of a philosopher there, who's saying that set theory captures everything exhaustively. There is no remainder. I don't know if the language of remainder, as in that there is something that always eludes its grasp, is I would shift that over to the as in this is one language that may well, in a sense, delineate, outline much of what's going on, but so might another language, poetic language, visual language, mystical practices, performances, arts, and so on. That basically levels everything. So there is no hierarchy, and certainly none that a philosopher can nominate, even in a self-effacing movement of saying, oh, it belongs to mathematical science rather than philosophy, when of course it is the philosophical gesture to point that out. And so there is still a kind of a passive authority, I suppose, going on there with Badiou. So in answer, yes, the set theory, nothing wrong with a bit of set theory, so long as it doesn't think it's the king of the hill, basically. So yeah, Gödel's number 4. There are other worlds and rational beings of a different and higher kind. Don't know about higher, but certainly. Bergson would say more maybe condensed. He talks about other forms of consciousness, a kind of nested theory of consciousness, different rhythms of duration, and how one, in a sense, experience, if you use the word experience rather than just consciousness, one experience can nest within another experience of duration, contracting. And temporally, of course, we have that experience in dreams, when in one moment at a certain rhythm can be experienced as much more distended. As in, so according to a clock, that was 10 minutes of sleep, but in my sleep, I experienced whatever, a week of torture or something like that. So rhythms, nestled rhythms of experience, one within another, would be the nearest to Bergson, talking about higher and lower. It's a kind of levels of duration rather than of, and so only difference of degree, although degree not understood spatially either. It has to be said.
Like the movie Inception.
Oh right, yes, the bookcases.
Nested time scales, dilated.
Yeah. Christopher Nolan loves that. I even preferred. I think it was less in your face. It was that moment in oh no, you said Inception. Did you Inception or Interstellar? Which book? Film did
I was thinking of Inception.
You're thinking Inception, yeah, exactly. Interstellar also has something like that, and that cosmos is made of love. But yes, Inception for sure in the dream sequences. And there's that kind of montage of about 4 different levels running at different speeds. Yeah, that's marvelous.
So yeah, just a final question. Is this part of a larger project, or is this an interest that you came to just through Bergson, and it's kind of its own thing?
It's kind of an aspect of a larger project. So I wrote a few things on time travel, in particular the film Somewhere in Time, which is a kind of, speaking of romance and the romanticism, it's a 1980s very you might say sentimental romance Christopher Reeve film. Did poorly at the box office in 1980. It has had an afterlife. You come across it every now and then on the Sunday afternoon on TV, and it's a nice little film, but has a really interesting conceit. It was written by Richard Matheson, adapting his own book, Bid Time Return. Richard Matheson, who wrote The Incredible Shrinking Man and a whole bunch of other things. But he's interested in the idea of time travel through attention span, through will, basically, and a kind of attention alteration. Not so much consciousness alteration, but attention. So Christopher Reeve, to go back in time, he has to hypnotize himself firstly into believing he is in the past. He wants to get back to a particular time, 1912, to meet the love of his life, who's already dead. But he must dress up in the right era. He must get himself surrounded. He must stay in a really old hotel, and so on and so forth. And this all happens in the film, seemingly as a kind of basic conceit. In the book, Matheson's own book, he's got a temporal lobe cancer in his brain, obviously. And that's eating away. That's in the background of these diaries he is writing about his story and how he was able to, by expanding his attention, go back in time. No machine, no DeLorean car, no phone booth, no whatever. Just good old-fashioned mind, in a sense, mind manipulation, self-manipulation. But with not purely Cartesian, not by closing your eyes and just wishing yourself there. It has to be performed, enacted. It has to dress in a way, has to stay in a certain place, has to learn certain inflections. And so on the one hand, there's 2 things happening. On the one hand, the simple phenomenon of the experience, the phenomenology of his experience of the past going in time. On the other hand, the underlying discourse that there is something in his brain that is eating away So it is merely in his head. It is merely in his brain as a hallucination, but Matheson never kind of decides. He leaves that open, that in actual fact, the brain disease is the time machine, in a sense. It's not so much his, his performance and all the rest, getting up in the kind of old-fashioned costume, period correct or anything like that. It is actually a brain disease, but the brain disease isn't a deflationary reduction of time travel. It really is time travel. Okay, so if you take that thesis, which is an interesting one, I think, and then you can look at other forms of dementia, other forms of mental time travel, and in a sense take these psychological states and then Bergsonize them, so to speak, by rendering them ontological. So different ways of remembering and forgetting can be re-rendered as ontological rather than as simply mental pathology and so on. So yeah, I'm going to expand more into that kind of area, looking at dementia, for instance, as not simply forgetting, but as a different kind of remembering, if you like, or time travel, but understood not in that objective spatialized way.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for the talk and the discussion. This would be the part in a more standard format where I would invite the audience to join me in thanking the speaker, but I think virtually, those of you at home or on the YouTube stream can join me in thanking John for the talk, and we hope to see you all at further GCAS events.
Yes, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for hosting, Kristen, and thanks for chairing, so to speak, Rocky, and I hope it made some sense, and it will increasingly make sense to me as well as time passes. Oh, I think I understand what that guy was going on about. Well, yeah, if you do drop me a line.